Welcome back to the Rabbit Hole Chronicles, where we examine the stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history. I'm your host, Percival Blackwood, and today we're diving into one of the most morally complex operations in American history. Here's a question for you. What do the Apollo moon landing, America's ICBMs, and the space shuttle all have in common? If you answered American ingenuity and determination, you're only half right. The other half of the answer involves former SS officers, Nazi Party members, and men who used slave labour to build Hitler's wonder weapons. Today we're exploring Operation Paperclip, the secret programme that brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists to America after World War II. And before you dismiss this as ancient history, consider this. The last of these scientists only left government service in the 1990s. Their fingerprints are all over the technology we use today. So buckle up. This is the story of how America won the space race with the help of Hitler's rocket scientists, and what that devil's bargain cost us. The race for Nazi science. Picture this. It's spring 1945. Allied forces are pushing into Germany, and the Third Reich is crumbling. But behind the front lines, special intelligence teams aren't looking for enemy soldiers. They're hunting for something far more valuable: Nazi scientists. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, or CIOS, was fanning out across Germany like treasure hunters, and they struck gold in the most unlikely place, stuffed in a toilet at Bonn University. There they found the Ozenberg list, a catalogue of thousands of German scientists and engineers who'd been working on Hitler's wonder weapons. Let me paint you a picture of what these teams were finding. Underground factories where V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp slaves. Jet engine designs that were years ahead of anything the Allies had. Nerve gas formulas that could kill thousands, guided missile blueprints that would revolutionise warfare. The Americans weren't the only ones on this scientific scavenger hunt. The Soviets were grabbing every German scientist they could find in their zone. The British were doing the same. It was like a twisted version of Black Friday, except instead of fighting over TVs, the world's superpowers were fighting over Nazi rocket scientists. And leading the pack was one Wernher von Braun, SS officer, rocket genius, and the man who would later become the face of America's space program. In May 1945, von Braun and his team made a calculated decision. They could surrender to the Soviets, who were closer, or make a dangerous journey to find American forces. Von Braun chose America. As he later said, he believed the Americans would be more likely to fund his dream of space travel. He was right, but that's getting ahead of our story. From Operation Overcast to Paperclip. The initial American program was called Operation Overcast, approved on July 20th, 1945. The stated goal was modest: bring over a few German specialists to help defeat Japan and assist with post-war research. President Truman gave his approval with one crucial condition: no ardent Nazis allowed. That restriction lasted about as long as you'd expect. By late 1945, the program was renamed Operation Paperclip. Why Paperclip? Because American intelligence officers literally paperclipped the files of scientists they wanted, with a note that essentially said, "Don't look too closely at this one's past." Let me give you the numbers. Between 1945 and 1959, Operation Paperclip brought 1,673 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. That's not including their families. Many of these men had been Nazi Party members. Some were SS officers. Several had used slave labour. A few were accused of war crimes. But here's where it gets interesting. When President Truman said no ardent Nazis, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, found a simple workaround. They just rewrote the scientists' biographies. SS membership, deleted. Nazi Party activities, erased. War crimes, what war crimes? One internal memo actually stated they should eliminate any information that would suggest employment of war criminals or ardent Nazis. Not investigate whether they were war criminals, just eliminate any information suggesting it. Quick recap. America desperately wanted German scientific knowledge. The Soviets were grabbing their own Nazi scientists, and someone decided that winning the coming Cold War was more important than asking uncomfortable questions about the past. The Rogues Gallery. Now let's meet some of the stars of Operation Paperclip. And when I say stars, I mean men who would go on to receive medals, honours, and in some cases, have buildings named after them. Werner von Braun, the Marquis acquisition. Former SS Sturmbannführer, that's Major for those keeping track. During the war, he ran the V2 rocket program at Peenemünde. His rockets were built at the Mittelwerk factory by slaves from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. An estimated 20,000 prisoners died building his rockets, more than were killed by the rockets themselves. In America, he became the father of the space program, the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon. He appeared on Disney TV specials and the cover of Time magazine. Kids had Werner von Braun lunchboxes. Arthur Rudolph, another SS officer who ran daily operations at that same Mittelwerk factory where slaves built V2 rockets. Witnesses described him selecting prisoners for punishment and death. His American career? He became project manager for the Saturn V rocket. For decades, he was celebrated as a hero of the space program. It wasn't until 1984 that his past caught up with him. Given the choice between a war crimes trial or leaving America, he chose to leave. Kurt Debus, SS officer who became the first director of what we now call Kennedy Space Center. Yes, the place where we launched missions to the moon was run by a former Nazi who had been colleagues with von Braun at Peenemünde. Hubertus Strughold, Luftwaffe colonel who conducted aviation medicine research for the Nazis. There's evidence linking him to freezing experiments on prisoners, basically torturing people to death in the name of science. In America, he became the father of space medicine. He literally wrote the book on keeping astronauts alive in space. The Aeromedical Library at Brooks Air Force Base was named after him until 2005, when someone finally decided that naming buildings after possible war criminals was bad optics. Walter Dornberger, Wehrmacht general who oversaw the entire V2 program. After the war, he was actually held by the British and investigated for war crimes related to slave labour. But America wanted his expertise. He was brought over, worked for the Air Force, then became a vice president at Bell Aircraft. He helped develop the X-15 rocket plane and early concepts for the space shuttle. Let that sink in. A Nazi general who used slave labour became a vice president at a major American defence contractor. The whitewashing machine. So how did men with such dark pasts get security clearances and eventually American citizenship? Simple. Their records were laundered like mob money. Here's how it worked. The JIOA would receive a scientist's dossier. If it mentioned Nazi Party membership, SS rank, or war crimes, and many did, they'd simply create a new version. Where the original might say ardent Nazi, the revised version would say not an ardent Nazi. Where it mentioned use of slave labour, that would vanish entirely. They even had a euphemism for it: cleansing the files. Internal memos show officials discussing how to cleanse backgrounds to get scientists approved. In one case, they took a scientist described as a menace to the security of the Allied forces and reclassified him as not a war criminal. The State Department and military created what amounted to an alternate reality. These weren't Nazi scientists. They were German experts. They hadn't been SS officers. They were former German military. They hadn't used slave labour. They had supervised wartime production. And it worked. By 1955, most paperclip scientists had received American citizenship. Their neighbours had no idea they were living next to former Nazis. Their co-workers didn't know they were taking orders from SS officers. It was a masterclass in institutional amnesia. The moral gymnastics. Now, defenders of Operation Paperclip will tell you this was necessary. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviets were grabbing their own German scientists. Operation Osoaviakim forcibly relocated 2,200 German specialists to the USSR. If we hadn't taken these scientists, Moscow would have gotten them all. There's some truth to that. The Soviets did get their share of German rocket scientists, including Helmut Gröttrup, one of von Braun's colleagues. Without German expertise, the Soviet space program would have developed differently, possibly slower. But here's the uncomfortable question. Did we have to whitewash their records? Did we have to make them heroes? Consider this. While we were rolling out the red carpet for Nazi scientists, Holocaust survivors were being turned away at American borders due to strict immigration quotas. While von Braun was getting citizenship and appearing on TV, Jewish refugees who had fled the very regime he served were being denied entry to America. One State Department official actually wrote that the scientists were more valuable to us than a dozen divisions. Another memo referred to them as intellectual reparations, like they were property to be seized rather than potential war criminals to be tried. The ethical gymnastics required to justify this are staggering. We fought a war against fascism, held the Nuremberg trials to establish that following orders wasn't an excuse for war crimes, then immediately turned around and recruited the very people who could have been defendants at those trials. The payoff, building tomorrow. But here's the thing, it worked, at least in terms of technological advancement. The contributions these scientists made to American technology were enormous. Let's start with the obvious, the space race. Without von Braun and his team, America doesn't get to the moon in 1969. Maybe not until the 1970s or 80s. The Saturn V rocket that powered Apollo was essentially a scaled-up V2, designed by the same team that built Hitler's vengeance weapons. When Neil Armstrong took that giant leap for mankind, he was propelled by Nazi technology. When Kennedy Space Center launched the missions, it was run by an SS officer. When astronauts relied on space medicine to survive, they were using research pioneered by Luftwaffe doctors. But it goes beyond space. Paperclip scientists revolutionized American aviation. Adolf Busemann introduced swept-wing designs that made supersonic flight possible. Hans von Ohain, co-inventor of the jet engine, advanced American jet technology by years. In military technology, they developed everything from guided missiles to submarine improvements. The Redstone, Jupiter, and Pershing missiles, all developed by von Braun's team. Early ICBM technology, German expertise. The Air Force estimated that paperclip scientists contributed $10 billion worth of research and development. In 1950s dollars, they even contributed to civilian technology. German experts helped develop synthetic fuels, new materials, industrial processes. Some worked on early computers and guidance systems. Others advanced medical research, though given how some of that knowledge was obtained during the war, that's its own ethical minefield. Let's be clear, American scientists and engineers deserve enormous credit. They took these contributions and built on them. But Paperclip gave America a crucial head start in the technological race that defined the Cold War. Cold War accelerant. Operation Paperclip didn't just affect technology, it shaped the entire Cold War. Both superpowers now had German scientists. Both were racing to build bigger rockets, better jets, more powerful weapons. The competition between American Germans and Soviet Germans accelerated the arms race. Think about Sputnik in 1957. The Soviet R-7 rocket that launched it was developed with help from German engineers. America's response, Explorer 1 in 1958, was launched on a Jupiter C rocket developed by von Braun's team. The space race was, in many ways, a proxy battle between German rocket teams. This competition drove massive investment in science and technology. It helped create what Eisenhower would later warn about: the military-industrial complex. Defense contractors hired paperclip scientists. Universities created departments around them. The Pentagon funded their research. By bringing these scientists into the heart of American defense establishment, paperclip helped militarize American science. It normalized the idea that scientific progress and military power were inseparable. It set precedents for recruiting morally questionable individuals if they could provide strategic advantage. The CIA would later recruit former Gestapo officers for intelligence on the Soviets. The School of the Americas would train Latin American officers with questionable human rights records. Once you've decided that Nazi rocket scientists are acceptable partners, where do you draw the line? The revelations. For decades, the full truth about Operation Paperclip was hidden. The American public knew some German scientists had been brought over, but the extent of their Nazi connections was classified or sanitized. The crack started showing in the 1980s. Journalist Linda Hunt filed Freedom of Information Act requests and uncovered hundreds of documents showing how the government had covered up the scientists' pasts. The Arthur Rudolph case in 1984 made headlines. Here was a hero of the Apollo program fleeing the country to avoid war crimes prosecution. The real flood of information came with the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Millions of pages were declassified. Researchers could finally see the original SS files, the documentation of war crimes, the memos about cleansing records. What they found was damning. Scientists who had been described as not ardent Nazis in their American files turned out to have been SS officers. Men cleared of war crimes had actually been implicated in slave labour and human experiments. The whitewashing had been systematic and deliberate. One particularly revealing memo from the Joint Chiefs used the phrase, "chosen, rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use." Not reformed individuals or former enemies turned allies, just minds to be used, regardless of what those minds had done. Recent revelations have been equally troubling. In 2005, the Strughold Era Medical Library was renamed after evidence surfaced linking him more closely to human experiments. In 2013, the Aerospace Medical Association removed his name from an award. Even decades after their deaths, we're still grappling with these men's legacies. The ongoing debate. So where does this leave us? Historians are split into roughly two camps on Operation Paperclip. The pragmatists argue it was a necessary evil. The Cold War was an existential struggle. These scientists helped America build a deterrent that prevented World War III. They contributed to technologies that benefit humanity: satellites, medical devices, civilian aviation. Yes, their pasts were dark, but their futures served freedom. The moralists counter that no technological advancement justifies harbouring war criminals, that by welcoming these men, America betrayed its values and the victims of Nazi atrocities. They argue we could have developed the same technologies without Nazi help. It just would have taken longer. Both sides have points. It's true that von Braun's rockets helped America demonstrate technological superiority that may have deterred Soviet aggression. It's also true that honouring SS officers with medals and citizenship, while Holocaust survivors were turned away at the border, represents a profound moral failure. What's often lost in this debate is that there were alternatives. We could have detained these scientists, extracted their knowledge, then tried them for their crimes. We could have employed them under strict supervision without making them citizens and heroes. We could have been transparent about their pasts instead of covering them up. But we didn't. We chose the path of expedience over ethics, secrecy over transparency, pragmatism over principle. The modern echoes. The legacy of Operation Paperclip extends far beyond the individuals involved. It established patterns that echo through American history. It normalized the idea that technical expertise excuses moral failings. It showed that classification and secrecy could be used to avoid public debate about ethically questionable programs. It demonstrated that in the name of national security, almost anything could be justified. These patterns persist. When we debate whether to work with unsavoury allies in the war on terror, we're having the paperclip debate. When we discuss whether to recruit foreign hackers despite their criminal pasts, we're having the paperclip debate. When we weigh security against ethics, we're having the paperclip debate. The programme also raises uncomfortable questions about American exceptionalism. We presented ourselves as the moral alternative to totalitarianism, while secretly employing totalitarianism's architects. We held war crimes trials while shielding potential war criminals. We preached democracy while subverting it through classification and deception. Perhaps most troublingly, Paperclip shows how easily institutions can rationalise the unconscionable. Smart, patriotic Americans, people who had fought against Nazism, convinced themselves that hiring Nazis was acceptable. They created bureaucratic mechanisms to launder evil into acceptability. They turned war criminals into heroes with paperwork and redaction. If it could happen then, what's happening now that we won't learn about for decades? Conclusion: the price of progress. Operation Paperclip remains one of the most successful and most shameful programs in American history. Successful because it achieved its goals: technological superiority, Cold War advantage, space race victory. Shameful because of what it required us to become. When Armstrong walked on the moon, was it worth it that an SS officer had designed the rocket? When American ICBMs deterred Soviet aggression, did it matter that they were based on weapons built by slaves? When astronauts survived thanks to space medicine, should they have known it was developed by doctors who might have experimented on prisoners? These aren't easy questions. They force us to confront the possibility that some of our greatest achievements are tainted at their source. They challenge the comfortable narrative of American righteousness. They remind us that history is messier than mythology. The last known paperclip scientist died in 2003, but their legacy lives on in our space program, our military technology, our scientific institutions. Every time a rocket launches from the Kennedy Space Center, it carries the ghost of Kurt Debus. Every advancement in aerospace medicine echoes Hubertus Strughold's research. We can't undo the past, but we can at least be honest about it. Operation Paperclip asks us a fundamental question. What are we willing to sacrifice for progress? In 1945, America decided it was willing to sacrifice moral clarity for technological advantage. The results speak for themselves. We won the space race, dominated the Cold War, became the world's technological superpower. But at what cost? That's the question that haunts Operation Paperclip. It's a question without easy answers, which is precisely why we need to keep asking it. Because if we don't learn from Operation Paperclip, we're doomed to repeat it. And next time, we won't have the excuse that we didn't know better. That's our show for today. If this episode made you think or made you uncomfortable, please share it. These are the conversations we need to have about how power really works and what we're willing to accept in its pursuit. Next week, we're exploring Jack the Ripper, the most infamous serial killer in history. But what if everything you think you know about the Whitechapel murders is wrong? What if the reason he was never caught wasn't incompetence, but a cover-up that went all the way to the top? Get ready to walk the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London and discover why some secrets are worth killing for. Until then, this is Percival Blackwood for the Rabbit Hole Chronicles, reminding you that sometimes the real conspiracy is what they did openly, with paperwork and filing systems and bureaucratic efficiency. Sometimes the most dangerous operations are the ones that leave a paper trail. The Rabbit Hole Chronicles is an independent production. We believe that understanding history, even its darkest chapters, is essential to avoiding its repetition.